the Italian Football Podcast.
Next question. Missak Olikian says, would it be smart for Juve to cash in on Douglas Luiz now in January if a permanent offer came from one of the Manchester clubs? I think he's just too lazy to play at this level. Juve always look most likely to concede whenever he's playing, which is funny coming from a player playing in a super intense league. And who should Juve target to replace him in your opinion? Also, Carlo, me and you have to apologise to Weston McKennie. I put my hands up and I just say I would never expect this from a player of his profile. Technical improvement at the age of 26 is something abnormal. Usually players show those sparks in their careers and then would polish it to show more, but he's become indescribably good these last few months and playing out of position on top of it. And we've got another question on top of that, which I think is interesting. Andrea Burns says, is Douglas Luiz the biggest flop in Juventus history?
I was actually thinking about this when I saw the question, and honestly, I think you can actually make the case that he is. Obviously, we're 6 months in, and if he is to stay at Juventus for the rest of the season, then we have to make that conclusion at least at the end of the season. We can't make that conclusion after 6 months. But based on what we've seen so far, I think there is actually the argument that he is that he could be the worst Juventus. He's on his, let's say, he's on his way to being potentially the worst Juventus transfer of all time. When you look at how much Juventus paid for him, 50 million euros. How he's performed, absolutely abysmal. Again, in that Champions League game against Club Brugge, just horrific. And then with the financial implications of his signing and the knock-on effect, Juventus now need to balance the books. How Juventus are considering selling a core player for their future in Cambiasso. How they signing Douglas Luiz meant that they left other areas of the squad with holes in them, like not having a striker for the first half of the season. How this transfer has, really been a disaster, not just for the player, but for the club, for everything. And he was supposed to be like the marquee signing along with Coop Miners. He's been a complete disaster. So yeah, I think he is. I mean, there's been other bad ones. I mean, Felipe Melo is from Fiorentina in 2009 for 25 million, which at the time was a lot of money. Diego as well, the same summer, 25 million from Werder Bremen, and both those two were very expensive disasters at the time. And Mauri in 2008, 23 million from Palermo. He was a total disaster. Christian Poulsen from Sevilla in 2008. They decided to sign him instead of Xabi Alonso. They rejected Xabi Alonso in order to sign Poulsen, which is unbelievable. And then, of course, you've got, some would even say Ronaldo, which sounds crazy. But, as we said earlier in the pod, although he's scored over 100 goals and, there's no complaints with his performances, but the financial implications of how that Juventus suffered from that years up, what we're seeing now today can be, the origins are there. And also Pogba. I know it was a free transfer, but that is definitely the worst return Juventus re-signing ever, for sure. Injured, then fails a doping test and then gets released. That was a total disaster. But yeah, I think it's potentially could be.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it's too soon, but we're definitely going towards that that area. As for Weston McKennie, are you prepared to apologise?
No, I'm not. Listen, you've got to have Juventus standards. Listen, this is Juventus, the most successful team in the history of Italian football, one of the biggest clubs in world football ever. This is not Tottenham. This isn't Dejan Kulusevski putting out a hype video for finishing fourth and we don't celebrate mediocrity or a few months of good form here. What I've said about McKennie on the Monday pod, I stand by, which is I think he potentially, this is the first time I've ever admitted this, so this is a concession. This is the first time ever that I potentially see a future for him at the level Juventus need as a fullback, as maybe a rotation option at fullback, not as a centre midfielder. As a centre midfielder, he's simply not anywhere close to the Juventus level of what Juventus standards are, which is winning Scudettos, winning top titles. If you want a player that can help Juventus get in the top four and do what they're doing this season, then yes, absolutely. Let's have McKennie and he can be a rotation option in midfield. But if you want real Juventus standards, it's like when Inter had I used to remember Inter fans saying, Ranocchia, because every now and again he would have a great game. Like when he did that clearance off the line against Bayern Munich, and then you'd see some Inter fans going,
Which Inter
Ranocchia.
fans would say that?
Inter fans.
Which Inter fans said that?
That's not Inter standards. Plenty. The same Juventus fans that say that the McKennie is good enough, which is not many. But you get reactive because he has a few good games, and you think, McKennie. McKennie is not a Juventus standard player. If you want to win Scudetti, do well in the Champions League, you would not have seen Weston McKennie playing in the Juventus teams that got to the 2 Champions League finals or some of the great teams in the past. So that's the issue.
I still think we should be able to say that I think he has improved vastly, and I think he does have a role to play at Juve. Maybe not as a starter, but definitely as a rotation player. I think he's proven that that in order to reach that level, you don't, step by step. I think McKennie has a role to play.
Yeah, we're talking about Juventus team. That's where have they finished in McKennie's time? They've been a top 4, like fourth place. They're 5th this season. These are the levels we're talking about. Juventus. The levels, the standards are way too low. And McKennie is not a Juventus standard player, even though he's improved. He's just not. As a fullback, rotation fullback,
player,
maybe.
Yeah, I think as a rotation player, I think he does have a role to play.
That's what he has been through this time. He's been a rotation player. He's been in and out of the team. Going through a little bit of a good period now.
I think you are a little bit harsh on him. I do think you're a little bit harsh, to be honest. I'm not saying he's good enough to start at Del Piero's Champions League winning side Juve, but what I'm saying is that you need to have, I think if you look at what he actually does, I think he does have a role to play at Juve, and I think he's been very good. I think he's been one of Juventus' better players this season, and consistently so too. That's my point. But whether or not that's good enough for a Juve who sees itself as one of the clubs at the highest echelons of European football, that's a separate debate.